Hi, my name is Afi. DJI has released the DJI OSMO Action for nearly about a year now. So here's a long-term review of the DJI OSMO Action. Now, this review of the DJI OSMO Action is from a perspective of someone who doesn't really do any kind of sports. First of all is the price. The DJI OSMO Action is quite affordable in my opinion. Currently on Amazon you can get it for around $260, which I think that's much more cheaper than when I purchased it last year, so it is quite affordable. Next, shall we talk about the low light capabilities? Now, this camera is not a low light camera because it has a relatively small sensor, a 1/2.3-inch sensor if I recall correctly, but it is sometimes okay in certain conditions in my opinion. For static subjects, or even if you're just holding it handheld at one spot without any movement, the image is quite okay, assuming that you expose correctly. But once you start walking about, I think that electronic digital stabilization kicks in and it makes the footage look worse. Now, to get effective stabilization with this camera, you need to be in good lighting. You need to be in good lighting if you want to utilize the stabilization. Otherwise, you will have a lot of these kind of digital stabilization effects in the footage, which is especially noticeable during night shots where you're forced to use a low shutter speed. Usually to get a cinematic effect, you use the 180-degree shutter rule. So the shutter speed is twice of that of the frame rate. I think that if you use a shutter speed lower than 100, you can probably see the effects of the digital stabilization. You're not recommended to use while moving while you're recording at night. If you look at this footage of me at the street market, you can see me try to add stabilization in post, but I think it still looks terrible. It doesn't help a lot. So all in all, do not use the OSMO Action at night while moving. If you're in one spot, that should be okay, but if you're moving, I think that really isn't ideal. Now, being an action camera, the OSMO Action is quite rugged and water resistant. Up until 10 meters, you have no issues when you're using it in water. This is a time lapse of me just running some water on the OSMO Action for some fun. So yeah, it's quite good. Now let's talk about the macro capabilities of the lens. It doesn't have any. Since it's a fixed focusing lens, it doesn't autofocus or anything like that. So you're stuck with whatever minimum focus distance that you have. So if you can see in the footage, the OSMO Action is in a sync. So you can see that the drain is not in focus. So definitely you need a macro lens to go with it. Let's talk about the slow-mo capabilities of the OSMO Action. Now, the OSMO Action records up to a 240 frames per second slow motion, which is quite great. It's a bit soft, but I think it does the job. You can still see some details in the shot even if you're shooting in slow-mo. In this shot, I'm using 120 frames per second as opposed to the 240 frames per second, and you can see that there is still some detail and that you can still read some of the signboards on the roads here. So all in all, it's quite a good feature to have. Now let's talk about the time-lapse feature on this OSMO Action. Now I usually use this camera for time lapses, usually by sticking it anywhere and just recording. I stick it on my car, I stick it on my window and just let it record, usually the weather or night lapses when I'm driving. However, it's not perfect. I think that if in the future DJI could improve the OSMO Action by actually allowing a longer shutter speed when you're shooting in auto exposure. Now, why do you want to shoot in auto exposure, you might ask? It's called the holy grail time lapse. You know, sometimes you might want to shoot a day to night time lapse, but unfortunately with the limitations that the OSMO Action has, you can't really do that because it caps out at 1/8 of a second. So if it gets dark, then you're probably screwed, unless that you manually change the shutter speed. It's not ideal because I think the strength of this camera is that you can leave it and forget about it. I've compiled a short tutorial of 3 ways on how to use the time-lapse feature on the OSMO Action. You can click here at the top right. If you're like me and you're shooting from inside the car, then you might need to get yourself a polarizer filter to go in front of the lens, because you can see the reflections of the windshield here in this footage. Now what I love about the time-lapse feature is that you can get some really abstract shots, so it's quite nice. Now for coloring, the OSMO Action provides a Cine-like D profile. So now what this does is that it gives you a flatter image so you can color grade later on in post. It's supposed to have the best dynamic range, so I tend to use this setting a lot. Now I'm not overly color grading it, I'm just color correcting it, so it looks okay to me. Now audio, the built-in microphone is actually quite good. If you're inside, there's no wind to speak of, so it is quite nice to use. Now have a listen to this microphone being in use. OSMO Action microphone testing 1, 2, 3. Let me know if this is clear to you guys. It's quite good. For it to be in something this small, which you can carry everywhere you want to, it is quite a good deal. Other things, DJI has consistently updated the firmwares to make it a lot better from when it was initially announced. Now I believe that the latest firmware allows for live streaming, but I haven't tried it yet, so it's good to see that DJI is constantly adding new features to the camera, which is nearly a year old now. Conclusion time. I'm pretty sure you can guess the answer, but do you think you should buy the OSMO Action now, especially at this current price point? Yes. I think it's a nice camera to have in your arsenal, that maybe if you're bored and you don't want to carry those big cameras, you can just take this along. Now it's not going to replace your camera, mind you. It's definitely not going to replace my X-T3, but it does make a good companion camera which I can take everywhere I want to. Again, my name is Afi. If you like this video, please subscribe. Let me know if you have the camera and if you have any other tips and tricks that I should know of. And let me know if this review helps you at all. And I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.